Welcome, friends, to another Before You Read lecture. This Before You Read lecture is on the 3 letters of John that are found near the back of the New Testament. I want to start by just sort of emphasizing or highlighting what some would describe as the accident of the New Testament canon, or the surprising inclusion of certain parts of the New Testament canon, if we wanted to put it slightly different. My sense is that many of us would understand why the Gospels are included in the New Testament canon, and certainly would understand why some of Paul's letters, or even something like Hebrews, has been included in the New Testament. These writings either give us a glimpse into what life was like in the early church, or they contain and communicate really sound or important doctrine. Now, when we get to the letters of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, my guess is that some of you, most of you maybe, are familiar with 1st John. This is the longest of the 3, and probably is the one that you've heard the most of in adult ed series, or in sermon series, or in something else. But if I was to ask you, if I was to quiz you, what is 2nd John about, or what is 3rd John about, my guess is you might be left scratching your head. And so one of the questions that I want to open with this lecture is, why the heck were these letters, especially 2nd and 3rd John, preserved in the first place? The place to begin this lecture is with a brief overview of the relationship between these 3 letters. How are they related? Are they related? And why do we think they are related? It's actually really an important question to ask, because when we read 1st John and then 2nd John and then 3rd John, we realize that there are actually some significant differences among them. We might consider first who's the intended audience of each of these writings. Both 3rd John and 2nd John give us an idea of who is the addressee, the one receiving the letter. In 3rd John, it is an individual named Gaius. But in 2nd John, it is addressed to the, quote, elect lady and her children, which many interpreters think is a honorific, as a sort of a symbol name for the church. Different addressees. 1st John doesn't really contain an explicit mention of the intended audience. It just speaks rather in the first or second person plural, y'all, or addresses them as little children. Doesn't give us a lot of the details about who 1st John was intended for. Likewise, the 3 letters aren't clear as to the author of these letters. Both 2nd and 3rd John identify their author as the, quote, elder, but don't give us a first name anywhere in the document. And then 1st John, the longest of the 3, doesn't have any reference to the author. There's no mention of the author, so it's technically anonymous. So we've got these 3 letters that are all named after John, even though John is nowhere named in any of them, and they're written to apparently different audiences, and at least one of them doesn't have a mention of the author at all. A third thing to notice then about this relationship, this complex relationship among these very short letters, is that they seem to serve different purposes. 3rd John is written, as I said, to Gaius for his Christian service. It acknowledges his Christian service, and it requests that he extend hospitality to some co-workers or friends of the elder who is sending the letter. It also commends Demetrius, who is perhaps one of these traveling associates of the author. 3rd John mentions some false teachings or the warnings about false teachings, especially somebody named Diotrephes. In contrast, 2nd John is not outward focused, but inward focused. It talks a lot about the community life, about the ways in which the church, members of the church, should love one another and be on guard against false teaching and practice hospitality wisely. And then First John is of an entirely different order. It's somewhat about outsiders, but it's also about insiders who have walked away, apparently, from the church. It's much longer, as I've mentioned a couple of times, and it is more explicitly theological, we might say, or Christological. It explores things related to the Christian faith. So we're left, really, if we just read these quickly and or slowly, we're left wondering, how are these three things related to one another? How are they, in fact, related to the name John, since none of them mention that name? And what are we to do with this? I raise all of this, maybe for the very first time for some of you, because I think one of the suggestions of Luke Timothy Johnson in his textbook, The Writing of the New Testament, offers a really simple explanation, and one that I think is pretty persuasive. And that is, he suggests that 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John make up a letter packet, that they were sent originally together. Now, you need to remember that the New Testament canon is arranged by order in large part, right? The length, or I mean by length in large part. So that the longest letter is going to come first, and then the shorter, and then the shortest. And that's the case with 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. 1st is the longest, 2nd is shorter, and then 3rd John is the shortest. But Luke Johnson suggests that we actually reverse the order. And we see 3rd John as something of a cover letter, a letter of commendation of those traveling associates of the author. And then 2nd John is sort of a short letter to the church, to members of the church, very similar to what we see in Paul's letters. And then 1st John is the sort of, that's the bulk, that's the material inside. And we could think about 1st John as a sermon or a speech or a theological treatise. It's doing some heavy lifting. But that one of the reasons that the church preserved these three writings was that they were ultimately related to one another. And that letter packet idea, I think, offers a lot of explanatory power for why 3rd John, 2nd John are preserved, because of their close association with 1st John. These aren't subsequent letters. These aren't things that were sent at a later date. They were all sent together in a packet. Now, as far as I know, Luke Johnson hasn't supported this with evidence from other ancient letter writing practices. But again, it's very persuasive, and at least something that is suggestive. And so I invite you, just for our time together, for this purposes, to read 3rd John first, then 2nd John, then 1st John, and see if there is some sequencing or ordering in that suggestion that makes sense to you. Since it is the longest and most developed, I want to spend the remaining of the lecture on 1st John. And just to highlight a few things, and then I'll offer us some reading strategies at the end. So 1 John, in terms of the author, traditionally it has been attributed to the beloved disciple, or John the Apostle. Now remember that the Gospel of John doesn't have an explicit mention of the author. It is attributed to the beloved disciple, or the disciple that Jesus loved, but that is an unnamed disciple. Likewise, 2nd and 3rd John simply identify the author as the elder, and 1st John doesn't have mention of a name. It's because of Revelation, who does identify its author as John, that this whole set of literature, the Gospel of John, the letters of John, and Revelation, come to be traditionally associated with John, the disciple of Jesus. In modern periods, most New Testament scholars doubt that sort of connection. Some have suggested that the Gospel of John and the letters of John were actually sort of the result of a school of some sort associated with the Apostle John. So maybe after he died, but in memory of him, and in sort of in collection, or in memory of him. In terms of the date of 1 John, you can find scholars who suggest a very early date and some who suggest a very late date. I think most scholars suggest that it was written near the beginning of the 2nd century, so around 100 CE. And that's because it seems like some of the opponents, some of the theological opponents, are representing theological views that we know of from the late 1st century or the early 2nd century. As it relates to the Gospel of John, there are some clear connections between John and 1st John. The language is similar, some themes are similar. There's actually a good amount of debate about which comes first, the Gospel of John or 1st John. One of the important differences is that the Gospel of John seems to reflect a recent and painful break with the synagogue, with other Jews. 1st John seems to be wrestling with a break within the Christian community. Some people have walked away, they've left the church, and 1st John is dealing with that crisis. When it comes to 1st John, and especially for us as contemporary readers, there is one thing that I think I want to highlight as a concern or a potential concern about 1st John. In many ways, 1st John is the New Testament's version of a breakup song. This is a song a letter rather, written in response to a significant break within the community. And as you can imagine, the hurt, the resentment, the anger sometimes comes through. And at the very least, we can read 1st John as evidence that communities, Christian communities, sometimes fall apart. And there are going to be parts of 1st John that we will look to and we'll say, that's a really helpful way to deal with that reality of community falling apart. And maybe there will be parts of 1st John that we say, no, that's not helpful. We need to find another way. And so I'm interested in what you think about that. Finally, just a few questions or suggestions about your reading. The first is, what do you think about this letter packet idea? What happens if you read 3rd John, 2nd John, and then 1st John? Does that change your perspective at all? The second thing to pay attention to is the emphasis on correct teaching in 2nd John and in 1st John. What is the correct teaching? What are the issues that 1st John and 2nd John seem to be wrestling with, especially as it relates to Jesus? And then finally, pay attention to the connection between the relationship between speech and action. How do you see the authors dealing with that, the relationship between speech and action? 1st John is a familiar letter. 2nd and 3rd are perhaps less familiar. I hope, though, that this video lecture helps you engage all 3 of them in at least new and creative ways. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and your observations about these letters. Now, happy reading.